Hello cyberspace, my name is Garrett Mills and welcome to setting up a basic PHP development environment in Windows. So I'm currently using Windows 10, but this should work on any modern release of Windows. But if you don't use Windows for development or you don't use it as a daily driver, be sure to check out my other videos on how to set this up in other operating systems such as Mac OS X. So we're going to start out by installing PHP itself. So this is the PHP downloads page, which I'll put a link to in the description. And you can see that there's two currently supported versions of PHP, PHP 7.0 and PHP 5.6. 5.6 is the older, more supported version, and 7.0 is the newer, bleeding edge, less supported version. Either one is fine for development these days, but for the purposes of our environment, we're going to be installing PHP 5.6. So to do this, we just click on Windows Downloads and then select the latest zip file for x86 or x64, depending on what platform you're on. So since I'm on x64, I'm going to select the VC11 x64 thread. So once it finishes downloading, you can go ahead and open the archive in whatever archive manager you prefer to use, and you'll notice something strange. They just give you the program files. There's no installer wizard. This is not terribly difficult to fix, but it is a little annoying. It just means we have to extract the files ourselves. So if we hit extract, we want to choose a directory that's easy to remember and pretty simple to reference. I recommend just putting it in a folder titled after whatever version of PHP you downloaded in your C drive. And you can hit extract. Once it's done extracting, we want to open up the folder so we can finish the setup. There are a few little settings we have to tweak. So opening our PHP 5.6 folder, we want to navigate to the php.ini/development and rename it just php.ini. Now if you can't see php.ini-development, it usually means you don't have file extensions enabled. This is a quick setting change in Windows, and I will put a link on it in the description to a tutorial on how to change that. So, since this is a development environment, this file is going to contain many preset variables for PHP in a development environment. So we can just rename it php.ini, and now PHP will read the settings from this file. Now there are a few settings that I recommend changing. So we can hit edit, and we want to scroll down until we see the extension directory. About a third of the way down, there's a variable called extension_dir. This tells Windows where to look for the PHP extensions and modules that we need to load. We want to set this to this default value, which tells PHP that it is in the ext folder wherever it's installed. We can do this by removing the semicolon in front of the line. This sets the variable we need. Now there are a few other variables we need to change to enable some important and popular modules. If you scroll down a bit further, you can see that there's a list of possible extensions that come with the PHP installation that we can activate. Now, it's important to note that these don't have to be installed, only activated. So there's a number that we might want to activate to make some development headaches go away just preemptively. So the first one is curl. Curl is a HTTP caller used in a lot of PHP apps. mbstring, which is a library. MySQL, which is one of the most popular database solutions of all time. MySQLi, the rewrite of that. OpenSSL, MySQLpedio. After doing that, you can hit Ctrl+S to save it and close it. Side note, if you run PHP and you get an error talking about how you're missing a VC runtime 140.dll file, this is not a huge problem. It just means you need to install Visual C++ redistributable. Because for Windows versions of PHP, that is a required runtime element. I'll leave this link in the video description. Just go here, download and install it, and it should be fine. So now we can close out of the PHP directory, open a command prompt, and we should be able to access PHP. Except, in order to do that, we have to tell Windows to look in the PHP folder we created to find it. So we can do this by opening the control panel, searching for path. clicking Edit System Environment Variables, click the Environment Variables button, and find Path under the System Variables heading, and click Edit. Click New, and then type in the PHP directory where PHP 5.6 or 7.0 was installed. OK out, and we just restart our shell. And now, running PHP-version shows us that we have PHP version 5.6.27 installed properly. This means that other applications as well as the shell can find and access PHP properly. The second element we're going to install is called Composer. Composer is what is known as a dependency manager for PHP. Now, packages and reusing code used to be a big problem because for many software developers you would have to manually update the code you used, and it was hard to make sure that it wouldn't break, or you kept track of the versions or kept other people's code separate from yours when developing programs. However, Composer solves all this by unifying the system and making it very defined as to how things work and where they're put. Composer is what's known as a package manager for PHP, and it is used quite commonly in more advanced development environments, and you'll find yourself using it a lot. And it keeps us from having to reinvent the wheel for every little thing we want to do, whereas we can just use code from someone who has decided to share it with the community. So, download Composer by clicking the Composer Setup exe file, save it. Once it downloads, run it, and then just walk through the wizard like you would every time in Windows. And you'll note that it found our php.exe in the directory we installed it. So, following a very standard installation wizard, we should now be able to open the command prompt, type in Composer, and you will see the default prompt for Composer. This means that it is installed properly. The final element we're going to install is called Git. Git is what's known as a version control system. Version control systems basically allow you to create snapshots of your code. That way you know at any point in time what was changed. They're used quite commonly in development workflows, especially for PHP applications, and especially for applications where more than one person is working on it. Git is by far and away one of the most popular version managers out there, and it's widely supported. And as you start developing more complicated or more complex applications, you're going to find that version control, it can be extremely helpful with debugging your code, tracking changes, and allowing the community to help you improve it. So, to install Git, we click the Download for Windows button and save the file. Then just wait for it to download. Once the download completes, we just flow through the ever similar Windows install wizard process. Agree to the license, accept the terms and conditions, and install directory, and then leave the defaults. Now, one thing I change, but you may or may not want to, is I changed this to use Git and optional Unix tools from the Windows command prompt. This allows you to use Linux style command tools like ls and wget from the Windows command line, which I find it's easier to press Windows R, type in CMD, and launch a command line than it is to use the custom Git command line just in day-to-day work. However, if you're okay with opening the Git command line, it's safer to just simply use the Windows command prompt. Once that finishes installing, we can click Finish, and now if we open a command line, we can run git version, and we can see that we are running git version 2.10.1 for Windows. So we have successfully installed the 3 fundamental tools needed to develop in PHP development environments. Next thing we're going to look at is our web server. Alright, now that we've got our basic infrastructure up and running, it's time to make some decisions. The first decision is what kind of web server you're going to use, and there are 2 main routes that I'm going to cover in this video. The first of them is Vagrant / ScotchBox. ScotchBox is a virtual machine LAMP stack. That means the server, including PHP on the server, the database software, everything runs on the virtual machine on your computer. So it's not actually running in Windows, it's running in a separate virtual computer that is running on yours. And this is preferable most of the time because it keeps the server and its software, network settings, overhead completely separate from your machine, so you don't have to worry about configuration and keeping it updated and like making sure the config doesn't break any of your Windows settings. It's just completely separate, and so say you're done developing, you can just turn it off and you don't have to worry about any of the server at all anymore. The other route is to just install a lamp stack locally in Windows, and this will work fine. It can sometimes interfere with other Windows processes, but say your CPU doesn't support virtual machines, or you just don't have maybe necessarily a powerful enough computer to run a virtual machine in the background while you develop, that's fine. We can just install it locally. So right now we're going to look at installing ScotchBox on Vagrant, the virtual machine. So if you want to skip ahead to installing Examp, you can click the little annotation in the bottom right hand corner to jump ahead. So this part of the tutorial is going to walk you through setting up Vagrant using a software called ScotchBox, which is a PHP development virtual machine. So there are three components in installing and setting up ScotchBox, our Vagrant machine. First of all, you need what's known as a hypervisor. A hypervisor is what executes and runs the virtual computers or virtual machines. In this case, we're using a free open source solution called VirtualBox. VirtualBox is completely free and runs on multiple platforms. So we're going to download the Windows version. However, if you've got, say, a VMware license that you would like to use, Vagrant supports that as well. Once it downloads, we again follow the ever-present Windows installation wizard. Just click through using the default settings, and it'll install. Now, a few things to note while this is installing. You will see a couple prompts asking you if you want to trust drivers from the Oracle Corporation. You always want to click yes and allow it to install the drivers, because it's going to install the network drivers and sound forwarding drivers that are necessary for your virtual machines, such as ScotchBox, to access the network and access your computer. Now, once you've installed VirtualBox or VMware or whatever, the next tool we need to install is called Vagrant. Vagrant is a virtual machine manager for the command line. This allows us to quickly create and destroy and launch virtual machines that are pre-configured by other users through the command line, so that we can use development environments, test operations, stuff like that, pre-made, and it makes it a lot easier to download and set up. So you can follow the link in the video description to get to the Vagrant downloads page and download the Windows version. Alright, so once the download completes, just run the executable and tab through the standard wizard. Alright, when the wizard finishes, it's going to ask you to restart your computer. Go ahead and click yes, just to let it clean up and finish doing Windowsy things. Alright, so after you reboot, we can check to make sure that Vagrant is installed by opening a command window and running Vagrant version. So if you get an output that looks similar to this means you've got Vagrant installed and properly configured. So now we are ready to install ScotchBox. Alright, so once we've installed Vagrant, we can now install our ScotchBox lamp stack. Now I want to talk a little bit more about how precisely this works. ScotchBox is a virtual machine image that comes pre-configured with a PHP development environment. Now what this means is it's basically just a snapshot of a virtual computer that Vagrant can download and then run using VirtualBox. Vagrant is just a command line interface for standardizing the way we interact with hypervisors such as VirtualBox or VMware. So what we're going to do now is we're going to download the ScotchBox image and install it using Vagrant. First, we need to decide where we want to keep this image and subsequently our code. I recommend putting it in your Documents folder, as this makes it easy to find. So I keep a folder called Code, and once you're in the folder, hold Shift and right click and click Open Command Window here. Now we're going to use Git to clone the Vagrant image. Now what this means is we're going to just run a quick Git command, and that's going to download the ScotchBox Repository. This is a much simpler way of doing it than downloading and copying the files ourselves. So I'll have this link in the video description, but simply copy that, and in your code terminal type git clone that URL and then whatever the name of your folder you want. So Scotch. Now what this is doing is it's pulling that entire repository down into the folder Scotch. So if we do a list structure, we can see that we now have a folder titled Scotch. And inside that Scotch folder is a few important things to note. Right now there's a Vagrant file, which is just the configuration file that tells Vagrant what to do when it's launched, the obligatory README file, and a folder called public. Now this folder called public will become more relevant later. Now the last command that we run is going to be Vagrant up. What this is going to do is it's going to look at this Vagrant file and it's going to decide what it needs to do. So the first time we run this, it's going to look for a virtual machine image for ScotchBox. Since it's the first time we've installed it on this computer, it's not going to find one, so it's going to have to download it. As previously mentioned, the ScotchBox image is kind of large, so the first time you run this Vagrant up command, it's going to take a little while to download and set up the machine for the first time. However, after that, anytime you launch the virtual machine, it doesn't take any longer than it would for a normal computer to boot, and it won't have to download data every time. So we can type Vagrant up and hit enter. And you can see it's found VirtualBox and it's going to begin downloading the Vagrant VirtualBox image. This is going to take a while, so grab a cup of coffee and just relax. Alright, so once the Plex image finishes downloading, it's going to go ahead and install and boot the virtual machine containing all of the web servers. Now Vagrant also does a couple really cool little things that make it super easy to get up and running quickly. It's important to note that this process of running Vagrant up, one, it won't always take as long as it did this time. It just took a while this time because it had to download the initial image. However, every time after this, all it has to do is start it just like you would turn on your computer. Another thing to note is you will need to run Vagrant up anytime you start developing again, because after you reboot your computer, to minimize startup overhead, it doesn't automatically start your ScotchBox VM. So say you reboot your computer and you want to start developing again, you will need to navigate to wherever you pulled your ScotchBox image to and run Vagrant up again. Another important command to know is Vagrant halt. This will safely turn off your virtual machine, so say you're done developing and you don't want the overhead running in the background, you can just run Vagrant halt and it will safely shut down the virtual machine. Now we can check to make sure that ScotchBox has installed properly. Simply open your favorite web browser and navigate to the following IP address. Now the way ScotchBox works is it uses VirtualBox's virtual interface technology to bridge the connection between the ScotchBox VM and your computer's network without actually interacting with your LAN. So this IP address will only be active on your computer while ScotchBox is running. And it's specific to your computer, so it shouldn't interfere with your LAN or any external networks and internet addresses at all. So if we navigate to that, we should see a page that looks something like this. This is fairly useful. It just shows you all the different database and server stack tools and like username and password credentials installed in your ScotchBox VM. So if you see a page that looks something like this, welcome to ScotchBox, insert version here, it means you've got ScotchBox up and running. We can go ahead and check where we installed ScotchBox. So in this case, documents, code, Scotch. We have a folder called public. Now this public folder is bridged between the virtual machine and your computer, meaning like files you put in there on your computer show up on the virtual machine. This means that in this folder we can put files that we develop on an IDE on our computer, and then they can be served from the server in the VM. This lets us have a more fluid development workflow. So for example, I can just make a quick sample text document And now, if I go into the server, you see that that document is now being served through the server because they share this folder. So if you create projects on your development server and you want to be able to use them through there, they need to go in this public folder. This is the public root of your server. So now that we've got ScotchBox properly set up, I'm going to go ahead and put an annotation in the corner to let you jump ahead to setting up your IDE. But if you don't want to use ScotchBox, we're now going to walk through the process of installing Examp, which is a local only non-virtualization server stack. Alright, so if you've made it to this part, you've obviously decided that you just want to skip all the trouble of a virtual machine and install the LAMP stack directly on your computer. That's great. We're going to be using a software called Examp. Examp is a fully featured LAMP stack for Windows. It contains PHP, MySQL, and like fake SendMail and other useful tools for PHP development. Now the first step is to go to the download page, which I'll have linked in the description, and download the Windows version that corresponds to your PHP version. If you don't know what version of PHP you installed, you can always check by running the command php tick version, and you'll see it right here, 5.6.27. That last little number is not as important as the first two, so you just want to make sure you get the version that corresponds with the first two digits of your PHP version. So we're going to go ahead and download this, and we'll be back. Alright, so once Examp downloads, we can go ahead and follow the pretty standard installation wizard that comes with the majority of Windows applications today. One thing to note is if you see this error, it's fine. It just means that UAC could cause some issues with file permissions. It's really not a big deal. I've never had any problems with it. Just tab through the installation wizard. At this point, you can customize the kind of things that you're going to need in your installation. So if you don't, say, need a mail server, you don't need Tomcat or Perl, you can go ahead and uncheck those, and that'll save some disk space. One thing to note is you want to write down where you install Examp to, because this is going to be important for where we keep our code when we get later on in the video. So in this case, I'm just going to leave it at the default C Examp folder and hit next. Alright, so once Examp finishes installing, we can leave this box checked and hit finish, and it should start the control panel. Obviously, since this video is in English, we're going to go with the English version. And here you have our Examp control panel for Windows. So this is where you can start the web server, database server, and FTP servers just by clicking a button. So once you hit the start button, you should see all of these turn green. If they don't turn green and say they fail to start, this is usually due to the fact that something else is already using the ports they run on. So be sure to double check and make sure you don't have like IIS or any other web servers, database servers running in the background, something maybe Windows had by default. And just make sure you have that disabled, and they should all start up nicely. So now we can launch our favorite web browser and navigate to localhost, and we should see a welcome to Examp folder. If you see this file, it means you have successfully installed Examp and it is running on your computer. So now we can check and look at our code folder by navigating to C Examp. This is the installation directory. It's self-contained, so it contains its own version of PHP, MySQL, everything. That way when you update your development version, it doesn't necessarily break this or vice versa. An important folder to note is this htdocs folder in Examp. This is your public root. This is where you can put files and they will show up in the web server. So for example, I can make a hello.html document. And now, if we navigate to our web server, ta-da! So, this examp/htdocs folder is important to note because this is where we will be putting all of our code. If you're fairly confident that you know somewhat what you're doing, you can go ahead and delete all of this default boilerplate examp, just like welcome, hello world pages. because this is the folder where we will be putting all of our development projects in order to use them. So a couple other important things to note about XAMPP is when you're not using it, you can open this control panel again and hit stop on all of these different services, and this is going to just shut the servers down so that they're, one, not taking up those ports in case any updating applications need them, and two, they're not just wasting system overhead when you're not developing. But make sure that if you're developing and you want to test your code, that you have these running from the control panel, otherwise it's obviously not going to work. Alright, so now we have yet another piece of the puzzle set up. We have our fundamentals and we have our lamp stack. Now it is time to install what is probably the most fundamental and important tool you use in your development, and that is the IDE, or Integrated Development Environment. This is so important because it's the program with which you write every line of code in your software. It's so much more than just a text editor. Modern IDEs have things like autocomplete for classes, and they can recommend and correct your code if you have errors, and it'll fix a lot of things preemptively that you would spend hours debugging in just a traditional edit a text file based setup, especially with languages like PHP, which are object oriented. Now again, there are two options you can go here, a premium and a basic route. The first one is the more premium route, and that is PHP Storm, an IDE by a company called JetBrains. PHP Storm is a paid product, and it is going to cost you a fair chunk of money. However, it is a fantastic, best of the best, this is what the pros use product. So if you intend to do any sort of super serious development, or if you're going to start doing development professionally, I definitely recommend shelling out the couple bucks that it's going to require to purchase and install PHP Storm, because it's definitely worth it. It is an amazing IDE. However, if you're just looking to develop in your spare time, or if you're not looking to become a professional developer, there is the open source Eclipse IDE. Now you may have heard of the Eclipse IDE before. It's traditionally thought of as a Java IDE. However, the folks over at Eclipse have wonderfully produced many offspins for different languages, including PHP. And the Eclipse for PHP IDE is actually a very full-featured, very well planned out and designed fantastic IDE, especially if you're just starting out, because it doesn't cost a dime and it supports many of the fundamental features like expansion, add-ons, code correction, object-oriented importing, and base classes, and all the important stuff. So we're going to take a look at installing the two different ones. We're going to start out by looking at how to install PHP Storm. However, if it sounds to you like Eclipse is the route you want to go, you can go ahead and click the little annotation in the bottom right hand corner of this video to jump ahead to the installation process for that. Alright, so getting started with PHP, obviously the first thing you're going to want to do is download the PHP Storm IDE. Hit the download button for Windows and wait the obligatory 5 to 10 minutes depending on the speed of your internet connection for it to download. Alright. Once the file downloads, we can go ahead and run it and walk through the seemingly monotonous Windows installation process. Alright, so once it finishes installing, we can go ahead and check Run PHP Storm and hit Finish, and it should launch the latest version of PHP Storm. Obviously, we won't have a previous installation of PHP Storm, so we can hit I do not have a previous installation and hit OK. It's then going to launch PHP Storm, whatever version you installed, and it will pop up a little box asking you to type in your licensing information. It already has my licensing information from previous installation. However, whatever method you go about purchasing PHP Storm, it'll be fairly simple to just click on the box and walk through that. So now we can go through the initial configuration wizard, checking your key map scheme. I prefer the following settings. However, it is entirely personal preference and in no way affects the actual functionality of the IDE. If you change any of those settings, it'll ask you to restart PHP Storm. Alright, now that PHP Storm is installed, there are a couple additional steps we need to do to get up and running before we're ready to create our first project. The first is to tell it where to find PHP. So you can do that by going to Configure and then clicking Settings, and then go down to Languages and Frameworks and click PHP. Now if you look next to Interpreter, you can see it has no interpreter. This means it doesn't know where to look for PHP. To tell it where to look, click the three little dots on the side and click the plus symbol. And then in the interpreter path, you should see, it should be able to find the version of PHP we installed. However, if it doesn't, you can click Other Local and browse to it and tell it where the PHP exe is. So, once it's done this, you should see it should automatically load with the PHP version you installed, in this case 5.6, and the full path to the executable. Once we do this, we can hit OK, and you're now ready to hit Create New Project. Now what you're going to want to do when you create a new project is in the location, you're going to want to save it to whatever folder is the public root for your lamp stack. So if you installed ScotchBox, that's going to be the public folder within the Scotch directory. If you installed Examp, it's going to be in that htdocs folder. That way, any project you create is going to be accessible through the web server. So once you have this IDE installed, you can go ahead and skip over the next little bit, which is going to be the Eclipse installation, and jump straight through to the conclusion. Alright, so you've decided for Eclipse as opposed to PHP. This is a good choice, especially for people who are just starting into PHP development. So we're going to go ahead and get started setting that up. You can navigate to the Eclipse downloads page, which I'll have linked to in the description. You'll want to scroll down until you see this little logo, and it'll say Eclipse for PHP developers, and then you're going to click the download button that corresponds to whatever architecture build of Windows you are running. Then hit the download button. Alright, so once that downloads, it'll be in the form of a zip file, which if we open, we can see that it is in fact simply needing to be extracted, which provides at least some respite from the ever-continuing installation wizard that seems to be omnipresent in Windows. So we can go ahead and extract this Eclipse folder wherever we want. In this case, I'm just going to do it to my Documents folder for sake of simplicity. And then we simply wait for the zip file to extract, and then we can start up Eclipse. Alright, so once it's done extracting, you can go ahead and navigate to wherever it is that you extracted it to, in my case, my Documents folder, and then just run this eclipse.exe. Now, if you want to, you can right-click and then do Send to Desktop Create Shortcut. That'll give you an Eclipse shortcut on your desktop, which will make it a little easier to access just in the day-to-day. If we go ahead and run this, we can see we have the latest version of Eclipse, which is Neon at the time of filming. Alright, so once Eclipse starts, you're going to see this every time you start up Eclipse. It's going to ask you where you want it to put the root of all your projects. This is where you're going to want to select either the public folder from your Vagrant ScotchBox install, or if you installed Examp, you want to select the htdocs folder. And this is going to tell Eclipse that it should put all of your code for your projects in the public root of whatever server you're using. So just for demonstration, I'm going to put the Scotch public root as my workspace and hit OK, and it's going to launch up the main UI. Alright, so once Eclipse starts up, you can theoretically just hit Create a New PHP Project, although I recommend going through the IDE Configuration Settings wizard just to fine-tune your experience, make sure it's exactly what you want. Alright, so once you've jumped through that Preferences wizard, you're ready to hit Create a New PHP Project, give it a name, and then hit Finish, and it will launch the workspace for you, and you're ready to get started developing PHP in Eclipse. Alright guys, so whether you've installed PHP, Storm, or Eclipse, Examp, or Vagrant, it doesn't matter, you're now ready to get started developing PHP in Windows. So be sure to subscribe to my channel and check out the rest of my series on getting started with PHP development, and I will see you in the next video.